Rowena, I promise you, Thorn will never be
Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the complete storyline and breaking down the epic recap of Mary Vampire King after Rebirth 2. Before we unpack this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Without further ado, let's get into the recap.
The first time Rowena died, it was not on a battlefield. It was not at the hands of a fabled monster, nor was it a sacrifice for the greater good. It was in a nursery, surrounded by the screaming, suffocating heat of a hellfire lit by her own sister. In her previous life, Rowena had followed the path of tradition. The world was governed by a fragile, ancient treaty between four ruling factions: the humans, the elves, the vampires, and the werewolves. To maintain the balance of power, the human king was required to marry his daughters to the heirs of the beast clans. The child born of these unions, the first hybrid, would become the prophesied sovereign, the next absolute ruler of the unified world. Rowena had chosen Jax, the eldest son and alpha heir of the Silvermoon werewolf pack. The legends spoke of werewolf loyalty. They spoke of a devotion so primal and fierce that it bordered on madness. Rowena believed she was making the safest, most logical choice. She believed she would be protected. But the legends left out the brutal, ugly truth. Werewolf loyalty was not born of romance. It was a biological imperative, an obsession driven entirely by the instinct to breed. When Rowena failed to conceive in the first 6 months, Jax's devotion mutated into violent, suffocating rage. He became a tyrant, locking her in her chambers, demanding an heir until her body was bruised and her spirit was entirely broken. It was only after she utilized a dangerous, forbidden blood magic ritual that she finally became pregnant. She bore him a son, a beautiful, perfect white wolf pup with human eyes. She named him Zeal. Zeal became the first hybrid, the rightful ruler of the world. Jax gained immense, godlike power, and for a fleeting, desperately short moment, Rowena believed she could finally live happily with her child forever. She was wrong. Her half-sister, Clara, had made a different choice. Obsessed with the ethereal beauty, wealth, and vanity of the elven courts, Clara had chosen to marry Prince Eldrin of the Sun Elves. Clara didn't know that elven beauty hid an arrogant, hedonistic depravity. Eldrin was a fickle player who rutted with every willing female in the ancient woods. Within a year, he passed a nasty, necrotic infection to Clara. The disease ravaged her body, leaving her permanently barren. Shunned by the elven clan and discarded by her husband, Clara was sent back to the human kingdom in absolute disgrace. Consumed by a venomous, unhinged jealousy, Clara could not stand to see Rowena thriving. She could not stand to see Zeal, the boy who would rule the world, sitting on a throne she believed should have been hers. Rowena lay in her bed, her limbs heavy and paralyzed. Clara had slipped a potent, odorless sedative into her evening tea. Through half-open, glazed eyes, Rowena watched helplessly as Clara stood in the center of the grand nursery. Clara's face was twisted into an ugly, demonic mask of pure hatred. In one hand, she held a torch. "Help me!" Rowena tried to scream, but only a pathetic, raspy breath escaped her lips. "You took everything from me!" Clara screamed, tears of absolute madness streaming down her face. "You took my crown! You took my glory! If I can't have a child, you don't get to keep yours." Clara dropped the torch onto the oil-soaked carpets of the den. The flames erupted instantly, a roaring, hungry beast that devoured the tapestries and the wooden crib. Rowena felt the blistering heat searing her skin. The smoke filled her lungs, choking the life out of her. She wept, silent tears boiling on her cheeks as she watched the fire race toward the crib where her baby boy slept. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the den were violently kicked open. A figure blurred through the smoke and the flames. It wasn't Jax. Jax was miles away, celebrating his newfound power with his generals. It was a man clad in midnight velvet, his skin as pale as marble, his eyes glowing with a desperate, frantic crimson light. It was Thorn, the lord of the vampire clan. "Rowena!" Thorn roared at the top of his lungs, his voice completely raw with panic. He threw himself into the inferno, his cape catching fire as he tried to reach her bed. Rowena stared at him, utterly bewildered. Thorn was the outcast, the monster. Why was he here? Why was he burning himself alive to save her? Thorn reached out his hand, his flesh blistering under the intense heat. "Rowena, take my hand." But the flames were too fierce. The heavy burning support beam of the ceiling collapsed, crashing down between them, a final, impenetrable wall of fire. Thorn could do nothing but scream her name as the roof caved in. The last thing Rowena saw before the darkness consumed her was the agonizing, heart-shattering grief in the vampire lord's crimson eyes. "Slap! Stop! Fight enough!" A booming voice echoed through the grand hall. "We need peace, and let the half-beasts govern the world. The treaty is unbreakable." Rowena gasped, her eyes snapping open. She took a massive, shuddering breath, her hands flying to her chest. She expected to feel the agonizing, blistering burns of the fire. She expected to smell the choking scent of ash and burning flesh. But there was no fire. She was standing in the opulent, sunlit corridors of the Human King's palace. She looked down at her hands. They were smooth, pale, and completely unscarred. She touched her face. She was young again. The sheer, impossible magnitude of what had happened crashed over her like a tidal wave. The moon goddess had heard her dying prayers. She had been reborn. Rowena looked around, her sharp mind instantly calculating the timeline. "I have returned," Rowena whispered, a cold, terrifying clarity settling into her bones. "It's the day of the interracial marriage alliances." A sudden, rhythmic thumping noise echoed from the heavy oak doors down the hall. Rowena walked toward the sound, her blood turning to ice. She knew exactly what she was about to find. If she had been reborn to this exact day, then Clara had been reborn too. And Clara, knowing the horrific fate that awaited her with the elves, would be making her move. Rowena pushed open the heavy doors to the king's private guest chambers. "Clara," Rowena said, her voice dropping to a freezing, absolute calm. "What the hell are you doing?" Clara scrambled off the bed, clutching a fur blanket to her chest. She dropped to her knees on the floor, looking up at Rowena. Her face was streaked with perfectly timed tears, looking the picture of a tragic, innocent victim of passion. But Rowena wasn't fooled. Behind the fake tears, Clara's eyes burned with a dark, triumphant ambition and thrill. Clara had secured the werewolf. She had secured the future ruler of the world. "Sister," Clara whimpered, her voice shaking with fake sorrow. "Jocks and I are truly in love. Please, let us be together. And we've already fucked. If I don't marry Jocks now, no other prince will want me as his wife." The Human King, their father, pushed his way into the room, having heard the commotion. "Rowena," the king sighed, rubbing his temples, clearly annoyed by the scandal but entirely unwilling to punish Clara. "Maybe you can pick another mate. Clara just got carried away and made a mistake." Rowena looked at her father. He was there too, speaking up for her, just as he always did. He always favored Clara because Rowena was his bastard daughter from a fling outside the palace walls, while Clara was born to his legitimate queen. Rowena looked down at Clara kneeling on the floor. I know she was reborn too, Rowena thought, her fists clenching so tightly in the sleeves of her dress that her nails bit into her palms, drawing tiny drops of blood. She remembers the elven plague. She remembers being barren. She wants the werewolf. She wants the endless resources, the loyal alpha, and the power of birthing the ruler of the world. The memory of the fire flashed in Rowena's mind. The memory of Zeal, her innocent baby boy, burning to ash because of the woman currently kneeling at her feet. Rage, pure, unadulterated, and volcanic, boiled in Rowena's veins. The urge to lunge forward, to shift into the feral instincts she had learned from the wolves in her past life and rip Clara's throat out right there, was almost overwhelming. Avenge Zeal, a dark voice whispered in her mind. But Rowena took a deep, agonizing breath, snapping herself back to reality. Killing Clara now would only get her executed for treason. Revenge needed to be calculated. It needed to be absolute. Rowena slowly uncurled her fists. She looked at Clara and put on a perfectly practiced, knowing smile. "Since you and Jocks are so in love," Rowena said softly, her voice completely devoid of anger, "I won't stand in your way." Clara gasped. She hadn't expected Rowena to agree so easily. She had prepared a massive, dramatic defense. The tears she'd forced out hung awkwardly on her lashes, making her look foolish. "Clara, get up," the king said, incredibly relieved that a political disaster had been averted. "Thank your sister for her blessing." Thank you, sister, Clara stammered, standing up, a smug, victorious sneer slowly replacing her fake tears as soon as the king turned his back. I offered Clara a calm smile, Rowena thought, locking eyes with Jocks, who looked slightly guilty but largely indifferent. He's just some trouble I don't want. Go ahead and take it, sister. You think you've won the prize. You don't know that his loyalty is just a feral obsession with breeding. Let's see how long you last when you can't give him an heir quickly enough. An hour later, the royal family stood in the grand throne room to finalize the interracial marriage alliances. Girls really do grow up and slip away too quickly, the king joked, trying to lighten the mood as the scribes prepared the ancient treaty scrolls. But when he turned and saw Rowena's cold, expressionless face, he looked incredibly guilty. He cleared his throat, pointing to the remaining crests on the table. Rowena, the king said gently, the only unmated heirs left from the ruling clans are the vampire lord, Thorn, and the elf prince, Eldrin. I think the elves aren't a bad pick. Their looks and status are way above the vampires, and Clara mentioned before father, Rowena cut him off, her voice ringing out through the silent throne room. She didn't even look at the elven crest. I'll mate with the vampire clan's Thorn. The scribes gasped. The king dropped his quill. Humans always saw vampires as cold-blooded, parasitic monsters. The world was full of prejudice against them. For thousands of years, no human princess had ever chosen a vampire alliance. Because of this, the vampires had never produced a world ruler. The lack of a hybrid heir got them sidelined by the other races, treated as outcasts, and cut off from global resources. They were effectively bankrupt, living in decaying Gothic castles on the edge of the world. The king stared at her in shock. Rowena, are you insane? The vampires have nothing. Rowena closed her eyes. She didn't see a bankrupt clan. She saw the blazing inferno of her nursery. Rowena, Thorn's voice tore through the roaring flames, raw with a desperation that defied his cold-blooded nature. He had thrown himself into the fire, his pale skin blistering, fighting through a hell that should have terrified a creature of the night, just to try and save a woman who belonged to another. I have made my choice, father, Rowena stated, opening her eyes, her resolve absolute. The king wasn't happy with her choice. He viewed it as a political waste. But seeing how determined she was, and perhaps out of guilt for allowing Clara to steal her first choice, he didn't push it anymore. He just sighed, signing the treaty with a heavy hand, and tried to comfort her. If things get tough in the vampire clan, Clara can help you out with resources. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed from the balcony. Clara sauntered down the stairs, having just finished dressing. When she heard Rowena had chosen to mate with the vampire clan, she couldn't hold back. Sister, Clara mocked, walking right up to her face. Even if you can't have Jocks, you don't have to pick the rundown vampire clan out of spite. Don't end up starving before you even pop out a kid. Clara turned to the scribes, ensuring everyone in the room heard her gloat. I hear the vampires are going bankrupt, Clara sneered. The werewolf pack is loaded. Even their bathwater is infused with precious moonlight. If your days get too rough, sister, I can pack up some leftovers for you. She said it all without caring about the servants' weird looks, covering her mouth and laughing hysterically. In Clara's reborn mind, the werewolf pack had endless resources, and Jocks was the ultimate prize. She was convinced she had secured the perfect, luxurious future. Rowena smiled faintly. My previous marriage with Jocks was not a happy one, Rowena thought. You think he's a devoted prince? Wait until the 6-month mark hits. Wait until his feral rage turns on you for not bearing a pup. Let's see if the moonlight bathwater soothes the bruises he gives you. Rowena, what's there to be proud of picking a broke-ass vampire? Clara demanded, annoyed that Rowena wasn't crying or begging. I'll be the first to get pregnant, Clara boasted loudly, rubbing her flat stomach. My child will be the next alliance ruler. I'll be the queen of the world. Rowena ignored her tantrum completely. She turned her back on her sister and went to prepare for her wedding in 3 days. The game had just begun, and Clara had no idea she was playing with a woman who had already survived hell. Clara was right about one thing: the vampire clan was dirt poor. As the days counted down to the wedding, the palace was flooded with lavish gifts from the werewolf pack for Clara. Carts of gold, silks, and rare jewels arrived hourly. Jocks was parading his wealth, ensuring the entire kingdom knew he was claiming the legitimate princess. Rowena's chambers, on the other hand, were entirely empty. No gifts arrived from the vampire territory. Rowena sat by her window, looking out at the setting sun. I worried they couldn't even afford a proper gown for the ceremony. She thought practically. I should probably plan to get one ready myself. She stood up to ring for her seamstress, but a sudden, unnatural chill swept through the room. The candlelight flickered and dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone walls. You do not need to trouble your seamstresses, princess. Rowena spun around. Standing in the center of her bedchamber, having bypassed all the royal guards and locked doors without a single sound, was Lord Thorn. This was the first time in her second life that Rowena really took in Thorn's appearance. He was breathtakingly beautiful, but in a completely terrifying, predatory way. He wore an immaculate, high-collared black coat with silver embroidery that looked centuries old. His skin was flawless, pale alabaster, contrasting sharply with his raven black hair. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were a deep, mesmerizing crimson, glowing faintly in the dim light. This was the one who had tried to save me in my previous life, Rowena thought, her heart skipping a beat. At the very last moment of my life, he was the only one who came for me. Thorn stepped forward, his movements possessing a fluid, hypnotic grace. He held a massive, ornately carved ebony box in his hands. He placed it gently on her vanity table and opened the latch. Rowena stepped closer, looking inside. She gasped. Resting inside the box was a blood-red trailing gown. The silk was so fine it looked like liquid fire. But what made it truly extraordinary was the bodice. The chest was adorned with glowing, dark crimson gems that pulsed with a faint internal light. I've never seen such a stunning dress, Rowena whispered, completely mesmerized. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the warm gems. Miss Rowena, Thorn said, his voice a low, aristocratic baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. This is hand-stitched by our vampire clan's finest tailor. The blood gems are blessings from our people. They are infused with our life force, meant to protect the wearer. He took a step back, maintaining a stiff, formal posture. This is the first vampire-human unity in history, Thorn stated, looking at her with deliberate distance, as if he wasn't the one about to mate with her. He was trying to protect his own pride, assuming she had only chosen him because she was the discarded bastard daughter. If anything's not to your liking, tell me. I will not force you to wear it. Rowena looked up from the dress, meeting his crimson eyes. She saw the centuries of rejection and isolation hiding behind his cold, formal mask. Thank you, Thorn, Rowena said softly, a genuine, warm smile touching her lips. I love it. Thorn blinked, clearly taken aback by her genuine gratitude. Before he could respond, the heavy wooden door of her bedchamber was violently pushed open. Clara sauntered in, her arm linked tightly with Jox's. They both looked incredibly smug, wearing lavish, gold-threaded outfits paid for by the werewolf treasury. Clara stopped, looking at the single ebony box on the vanity. She burst into a cruel, mocking laugh. Sister, Clara sneered. You can't seriously have just this one dress? Jox prepared a whole 10 wedding gowns for me, each one sexier and more expensive than... Are the vampires really so broke they can only afford one piece of fabric? Rowena didn't even look at her sister, she looked at Jox. Jox was staring at Clara with a heavy, obsessive, feral hunger in his eyes. He wasn't looking at Clara with love. He was looking at her like a piece of breeding livestock. Clara only knows werewolves are deeply loyal, Rowena thought, an icy smirk playing on her lips. But she didn't get that it was pure instinct making them fixated on breeding. If she didn't give him a pup soon, would Jock still pamper her? Thorn, however, did not take the insult lightly. The vampire lord's grip on his silver-tipped scepter tightened. The metal groaned under his supernatural strength. He stepped forward, placing himself protectively between Rowena and the two arrogant intruders. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, a suffocating, lethal predatory aura flooding the space. Jox's wolf instincts flared, and he actually took a subconscious step backward, intimidated by the ancient vampire. Thorn ignored Clara and Jox entirely. He turned his head slightly, looking at Rowena with absolute deadly seriousness. It is my vampire clan that has wronged you, Miss Rowena, by not being able to provide the shallow luxuries of dogs, Thorn said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute vow. But I promise you this. Thorn will never betray you in this life, Clara scoffed, completely oblivious to the lethal danger radiating from the vampire. Pretty words are easy, bloodsucker, Clara mocked loudly. Let's see if you can even knock her up. Vampires are practically walking corpses. Clara turned to Rowena, unable to stop yapping about babies, her past life trauma of being barren driving her absolute obsession. Sister, focus on your own mating. Someone might think you're eyeing my fiancé again. Rowena smiled faintly at Clara. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She simply reached out, sliding her small, warm hand into Thorn's freezing, pale grip. Thorn's breath hitched slightly at the contact, but his fingers instinctively tightened protectively around hers. "Let us go, my lord," Rowena said softly, ignoring the werewolf and her sister completely. In the midst of Clara and Jacques' ugly, confused expressions, Rowena took Thorn's hand and walked out of the room, leaving the ebony box and the blood-red gown safe on the vanity. As they walked down the stone corridor, soon, from behind, Rowena heard Clara flirting loudly with Jacques, her voice echoing off the walls. "My stupid sister," Rowena thought, her grip tightening on the Vampire King's hand. "Reborn, and still obsessed with rising through motherhood. You chose the beast, Clara. Let's see how you survive the bite." The day of the interracial marriage alliances arrived, casting a tense, chaotic energy over the human capital. By tradition, the ceremonies were held simultaneously in the grand courtyards of the royal palace, divided by a massive aisle of white marble. On the eastern side of the courtyard, the sun blazed down on the Silver Moon werewolf delegation. It was a spectacle of obscene, chaotic wealth. Massive chests of gold coins, pelts of mythical beasts, and rare gemstones were piled high. The werewolf generals, massive men with wild hair and golden eyes, drank heavily from barrels of mead, laughing boisterously and tearing into roasted meats with their bare hands. Clara stood at the werewolf altar, wearing the first of her 10 extravagant wedding gowns. It was a heavy, suffocating monstrosity of white silk, crusted with so many diamonds that she could barely walk. She looked smug, basking in the envious stares of the human nobles. Jacques stood beside her, his chest puffed out, radiating the aggressive, suffocating dominance of an alpha claiming his prize. On the western side of the courtyard, the atmosphere was entirely different. The sun seemed to dim naturally as it crossed over the vampire clan's delegation. There were no chests of gold. There were no drunken cheers. There was only a small vanguard of 12 vampire elites, clad in immaculate, centuries-old black armor. They stood in perfect, absolute silence, their crimson eyes scanning the crowd with lethal precision. And standing at their center, wearing the blood-red gown, was Rowena. The dress was a masterpiece. As she moved, the silk flowed like liquid fire, and the dark crimson gems embedded in the bodice pulsed with a faint, warm, rhythmic light that matched the beating of her own heart. The human nobles who had planned to sneer at her bankrupt choice found themselves completely silenced by her breathtaking, terrifying majesty. She did not look like a discarded bastard daughter. She looked like a goddess of death. Thorn waited for her at the altar. He wore a regal obsidian crown that rested upon his raven hair. As Rowena approached, he stepped down, offering his pale, marble-cool hand. "You look beautiful, Rowena," Thorn whispered, his voice for her ears alone, vibrating with a deep, ancient reverence. "And you look like a true king, my lord," Rowena smiled, stepping up beside him. From across the aisle, Clara couldn't resist a final, petty jab as the high priest raised his hands to bless the unions. "Enjoy the famine, sister," Clara called out, her voice carrying over the silent courtyard. The werewolf generals erupted into mocking laughter. "I'll be sure to send you a scrap of meat when my pup is born." Thorn's jaw clenched, his fangs extending slightly behind his lips in a flash of lethal, protective fury. He stepped forward, ready to silence the foolish princess permanently. But Rowena gently squeezed his hand, anchoring him. "Let her boast, Thorn," Rowena whispered, her eyes locking onto Clara's smug face with a cold, terrifying foresight. "The higher the pedestal she builds today, the further she will fall tomorrow." The priest struck the ceremonial gong. The vows were spoken, the blood oaths were bound. The two sisters had officially crossed the threshold of no return, sealing their fates to the beasts they had chosen. That evening, Clara rode in a massive, gold-plated carriage toward the Silver Moon Pack's territory in the northern mountains. She leaned back against the plush velvet cushions, sipping expensive wine, dreaming of the luxurious palace that awaited her. She imagined sprawling gardens, servants fanning her with peacock feathers, and Jacques showering her with endless devotion. But as the carriage crossed the border into the werewolf lands, the reality of the Silver Moon Pack began to set in. There were no palaces. The werewolf capital was a massive, brutalist fortress of rough-hewn stone and timber built into the side of a jagged mountain. It was primal, functional, and completely devoid of the delicate luxuries Clara had expected. As Clara stepped out of the carriage, the heavy, metallic scent of blood and wet fur assaulted her senses. "Jocks, darling," Clara said, her nose wrinkling in disgust as she lifted the hem of her diamond-crusted dress to avoid the muddy ground. "Where is the royal manor? Surely we aren't staying in these caves?" Jocks, who had been riding his massive dire wolf mount beside the carriage, dismounted. The fawning, romantic prince who had seduced her in the guest chambers was gone. In his place was the alpha. His golden eyes were hard, focused entirely on the pack elders who had gathered to greet them. "This is the alpha's den," Jocks stated coldly, not even looking at her. "It is the heart of the pack. You are a Luna now, Clara. Start acting like one." Clara flinched, shocked by his harsh tone. "But, my luggage? My other 9 dresses? Leave them," an ancient, scarred female werewolf barked, stepping forward. She was the pack seer. She looked Clara up and down with absolute disdain, sniffing the air around her. "Silk and diamonds do not breed strong pups. Strip her." "What?" Clara shrieked, backing away. "Jocks, tell them to stop." But Jocks didn't stop them. He watched with crossed arms as 2 massive female werewolves grabbed Clara, roughly stripping her of her expensive wedding gown until she stood shivering in a simple, coarse linen shift. "The moonlight bath awaits," the seer announced. Clara remembered her own boast to Rowena. Even their bathwater is infused with precious moonlight. She had imagined a warm, luxurious spa filled with rose petals and glowing magic. Instead, she was dragged out behind the fortress to a deep, jagged crater filled with freezing, glacial water that reflected the full moon. "Get in," Jocks commanded, his voice echoing with the unnatural, compelling force of the alpha command. "It's freezing." Clara wept, her teeth chattering. "Jocks, please. I'm your wife. We are in love." "Love," Jocks scoffed, his feral instincts entirely overriding the polite human facade he had worn at the palace. He stepped forward, grabbing Clara by the back of the neck, his grip bruising and unbreakable. "You were chosen for your hips, human. The moonlight spring purifies the womb. We need a pup, Clara, a hybrid to rule the world. And we need it now." He shoved her violently into the freezing, bone-chilling water. As Clara went under, the icy water stealing the breath from her lungs, the horrifying, unvarnished truth of the werewolf pack finally crashed down upon her. There was no romance. There was no luxury. She was not a queen to them. She was breeding stock, and if she didn't produce the prophesied heir quickly enough, this freezing spring would be the least of her torments. Hundreds of miles to the south, Rowena's journey was vastly different. She rode beside Thorn in a sleek black carriage drawn by 4 massive, red-eyed nightmare steeds. They traveled deep into the Nightlands, a territory shrouded in perpetual, misty twilight and ancient, towering shadow pines. "We are approaching the Crimson Keep," Thorn said quietly, looking out the carriage window. Rowena leaned forward. Through the mist, a massive Gothic castle emerged. It was built from polished obsidian, its towering spires reaching up like dark fingers grasping at the moon. It was true that the vampire clan lacked modern wealth. There were no gold-plated gates or diamond-crusted walls. The stones were ancient, covered in climbing ivy and centuries of weather. But it was breathtakingly majestic. It possessed a haunting, dignified beauty that no amount of werewolf gold could ever buy. As the carriage pulled into the courtyard, hundreds of vampires were waiting. They were dressed in faded but impeccably clean aristocratic clothing. They did not shout or drink or howl. They stood in perfect, disciplined silence. When Thorn stepped out of the carriage, every single vampire in the courtyard dropped to one knee, bowing their heads in absolute, unwavering loyalty to their king. Thorn turned and offered his hand to Rowena. As she stepped out, the pulsing blood gems on her red gown cast a warm, crimson glow over the dark cobblestones. A collective, reverent gasp rippled through the kneeling vampires. For centuries, humans had called them monsters. No human royalty had ever graced their halls. Yet here stood a princess, wearing their sacred blood gems, standing proudly beside their lord. "Rise, my people," Thorn's voice echoed through the courtyard. An elderly vampire, wearing the robes of a high chancellor, stepped forward. His eyes were wide with awe as he looked at Rowena. "My lord," the chancellor whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "She wears the blood heart stones. The blessing has accepted her." Rowena looked down at the gems on her bodice. They were glowing brighter now, pulsing in a steady, comforting rhythm. "What does he mean, Thorn?" Rowena asked softly. Thorn looked at her, his crimson eyes filled with a deep, tragic nobility. "The blood gems are not merely jewelry, Rowena," Thorn explained, his voice low. "They are crystallized drops of life force, willingly given by the elders of our clan over centuries. They are meant to protect the wearer from all harm. If a human heart rejected us, the stones would turn to ash. But you do not fear us. And so, the stones have bound themselves to your life force to protect you." Rowena's breath hitched. In her past life, Jocks had given her heavy gold chains that felt like shackles. But Thorn had given her the collective protective magic of his entire people. "Come," Thorn said gently, offering his arm. "The keep is old, and it is cold. But while you are here, you will be treated as the absolute sovereign of this domain." That night, Rowena sat on the edge of a massive four-poster bed in the Lord's private chambers. The room was lit by hundreds of flickering black candles, casting a warm, dancing glow over the ancient tapestries. She wore a delicate black silk nightgown, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy. She knew what was expected on a wedding night. In her past life, Jocks had treated her like a piece of meat, asserting dominance and taking what he wanted with brutal, feral efficiency. The heavy oak door opened with a soft click. Thorn entered the room. He had removed his heavy formal coat, wearing only a loose white poet shirt that was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the pale, flawless skin of his chest. He stopped a few feet away from the bed, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked incredibly tense, his jaw clenched, his eyes deliberately fixed on the floor rather than on her. "Rowena," Thorn began, his voice tight with restraint. "I know why you chose me. I know you did it to escape the werewolf's temper, and perhaps to spite your sister. I do not harbor any illusions of romance." Rowena frowned, standing up from the bed. "Thorn, please, let me finish," Thorn interrupted gently, raising a hand. "You are human. You need warmth, sunlight, and a gentle life. I am a creature of the dark. My clan is impoverished. I cannot offer you the world." He finally looked up, his crimson eyes meeting hers, burning with an intense, tragic sincerity. "But I will never force myself upon you," Thorn vowed. "The rumors of vampire mating, of bloodlust and violence, they are human myths. I will sleep in the adjoining chambers. You will remain untouched, and you will remain safe. You have my word as king." He bowed deeply, turning to leave the room. Rowena stared at his broad back. This man, the supposed bloodthirsty monster, was willing to endure the humiliation of an unconsummated marriage and deny his own instincts entirely, just to ensure she felt safe. He was the exact opposite of Jocks. "Thorn, wait," Rowena said. Thorn stopped, his hand on the heavy iron doorknob. Rowena walked across the stone floor, her bare feet completely silent. She stopped right behind him. She reached out, her small, warm hands gently gripping his broad shoulders. She felt him stiffen instantly, a subtle shudder running through his cold, immortal frame at her touch. "In my past," Rowena whispered, the truth of her rebirth bleeding into her words, though she knew he wouldn't fully understand it yet. "I made choices based on what the world told me was safe. The world told me the werewolf was loyal. The world told me the vampire was a monster." She slowly stepped around him, placing herself between Thorn and the door. "But the world is blind, Thorn," Rowena said, looking up into his mesmerizing, glowing eyes. "I didn't choose you to spite my sister. I didn't choose you to escape." She reached up, her fingertips gently tracing the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw. "I chose you because when the fire comes," Rowena whispered, the memory of him burning alive to save her flashing in her mind, "you are the only one who runs into it for me." The agonizing, suffocating heat was the only thing I could feel. Flames the color of freshly spilled blood licked at the high stone walls of the nursery, rapidly devouring the beautiful oak crib that held my son. The thick, noxious black smoke burned my lungs with every frantic gasp for air. I screamed until my throat was completely raw, throwing my body against the heavy iron-reinforced door, but it was locked tight from the outside. "Zeal," I shrieked, my voice cracking in absolute terror. I dove through the curtain of fire, ignoring the searing pain as the flames caught the hem of my silk nightgown. I reached into the burning crib, pulling my precious baby into my arms. Zeal, my beautiful little white furred pup, whimpered weakly, his tiny chest heaving as the oxygen in the room rapidly disappeared. I fell to my knees in the center of the burning room, clutching my son tightly against my chest, desperately trying to shield him from the intense heat with my own body. Through the roaring sound of the inferno, I heard it. Laughter. It was high, cruel, and entirely unhinged, echoing from the hallway just on the other side of the heavy door. It was a laugh I had known since childhood. "Burn, you pathetic bitch!" Arabella, my own sister, screamed from the other side, her voice dripping with venomous, unchecked jealousy. "Burn with your filthy little mutt! You stole the crown that was rightfully mine! Now I'll watch you turn to ash! Arabella, please!" I sobbed, coughing violently as the smoke filled my lungs. "Please, just let Zeal out. He's just a baby. He hasn't done anything to you. He is the reason you are the queen!" She shrieked hysterically. Arabella's hatred was a bottomless, toxic well. Years ago, on the Day of Alliance, we were both presented as human brides. The world had barely survived a devastating, century-long war between humans, vampires, werewolves, and the elusive forest elves. To forge a lasting peace, a sacred pact was made. The species that successfully bred the first hybrid child with a pure human bride would claim absolute rulership over the entire world for the next 100 years. I had chosen Jox, the fiercely loyal, imposing alpha of the Silver Moon werewolf pack. I had loved him, and together, we had brought Zeal into the world. Our white-furred son was the firstborn hybrid, elevating Jox to the throne and making me the queen of the new era. Arabella, entirely blinded by superficial vanity, had chosen to marry into the elven royalty. She was utterly mesmerized by the otherworldly, ethereal beauty of the elf prince. But her fairy tale quickly shattered. The elven prince was notoriously promiscuous, sleeping with countless females across the enchanted forest. Ultimately, Arabella contracted a severe magical disease from him, a sickness that ravaged her body and left her completely barren. While I sat on a throne nursing the heir to the world, my sister sat in a secluded forest pavilion, rotting from the inside out, her womb a barren wasteland. The jealousy had driven her completely insane. "This is the end of your line, sister." Arabella laughed maniacally over the crackling flames. The heavy wooden ceiling beams began to violently groan above me, the structural integrity completely failing under the intense heat. I looked down at Zeal. His small chest stopped moving. The smoke inhalation had already taken him. A profound, soul-shattering wail tore from my lips. My beautiful boy was gone. The world around me faded into a blinding, agonizing sea of fire as a massive burning beam collapsed directly on top of us. The pain was absolute, consuming every fiber of my being. I closed my eyes, accepting the dark, agonizing abyss of death. And then, I gasped. My eyes flew open. I wasn't burning. I wasn't dying. I was taking in massive, desperate gulps of cool, incredibly fresh air. I violently sat up, clutching my chest. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked frantically at my hands. They weren't blistered or charred. My skin was perfectly pale, flawless, and completely untouched by fire. "What? What is happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I looked around the room. I wasn't in the burning nursery of the royal palace. I was sitting on a plush, velvet chair in a massive, brightly lit antechamber. The walls were adorned with intricate tapestries, and the sound of hushed, nervous murmurs filled the air. Dozens of young, beautiful human women were standing around me, wearing elegant, ceremonial white gowns. I looked down at my own body. I was wearing the exact same white gown. Panic and utter disbelief warred in my mind. I recognized this room. I knew exactly where I was, and more importantly, I knew when I was. This was the grand antechamber of the Alliance Hall. It was the Day of Alliance. I had died in the flames, but somehow, inexplicably, the universe had spun backward. I had been reborn. I had been sent back in time to the very day that would decide the fate of the entire world, the day I would choose my husband. Before I could even attempt to process the monumental, impossible reality of my rebirth, the heavy oak doors of the antechamber swung open. The Grand Herald stepped into the room, his voice booming over the nervous chatter of the human brides. "The rulers of the supernatural clans have arrived. The herald announced, "It is time for the choosing. Present yourselves." The girls began to line up, their faces pale with anxiety and anticipation. I stood up on unsteady legs, my mind still reeling from the phantom heat of the fire. As I moved to join the line, a sharp, entirely deliberate shove hit my shoulder, nearly knocking me back to the floor. I stumbled, catching my balance just in time. I looked up, my eyes narrowing. It was Arabella. She looked exactly as she had all those years ago, stunningly beautiful, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her lips painted a deep, ambitious crimson. But the look in her eyes was entirely different. There was no innocence, no sisterly affection. Her eyes were burning with a dark, triumphant, and fiercely knowledgeable malice. "Watch your step, sister," Arabella sneered, leaning in close. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "I'm not letting you steal the crown from me this time." A cold shockwave rippled down my spine. She remembered. Arabella hadn't just survived the fire she set. She had been reborn, just like me. She knew exactly what the future held. She knew that the alpha werewolf was the key to absolute power, and she was determined to rewrite history and claim that power for herself. I stared at her, my initial shock rapidly solidifying into a cold, hardened resolve. The terrified, naive girl who had simply wanted a peaceful life was dead, burned to ash in that nursery alongside her infant son. In her place stood a woman forged in betrayal and fire. "The crown," I replied softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Arabella smirked, flipping her golden hair over her shoulder. "That's right. You can have the pathetic, diseased elf prince. I am choosing the alpha." She turned and confidently marched toward the front of the line, her hips swaying with arrogant certainty. I watched her walk away, a slow, dark, and utterly cynical smile creeping across my face. Arabella thought she had just outsmarted destiny. She thought she had stolen the ultimate prize by claiming Jocks before I could. But my dear sister didn't know the whole truth. She had only seen the glory of Jocks's reign from the outside. She didn't know the dark, horrifying secret that the Silver Moon Pack violently kept hidden from the rest of the world. She didn't know that during his annual rut, Jocks transformed into a mindless, savage monster. He was brutal, entirely unable to control his primal, devastating urges in bed. Before me, he had violently torn countless human mates apart, leaving their broken bodies to be quietly buried in the woods. I had only survived his rut by sheer luck and intense magical fortification. "Go ahead, Arabella," I thought, my smile widening into something truly predatory. "Take the alpha, take the crown, and let's see how long you survive in the monster's bed." The grand doors opened entirely, revealing the massive Alliance Hall. At the far end of the room stood 3 thrones. On the left, the ethereal elf prince, his beauty blinding and deceptive. In the center, Jocks, the towering, muscular alpha werewolf, his golden eyes scanning the human brides with thinly veiled, terrifying hunger. And on the right, shrouded in absolute, impenetrable shadows, the Vampire King. As Arabella confidently marched straight toward Jocks, practically throwing herself at the werewolf's feet, I stepped into the hall. I didn't look at the wolf. I didn't look at the elf. My eyes locked directly onto the terrifying, crimson gaze of the Vampire King. The game had just changed, and this time, I wasn't playing for peace. I was playing for absolute bloody revenge. The Grand Alliance Hall fell into a suffocating, deathly silence. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, polished marble, and the overwhelming pheromones radiating from the 3 supernatural monarchs seated at the far end of the vast room. A collective, echoing gasp rippled through the ranks of the human brides as my sister, Arabella, brazenly broke protocol. Instead of waiting to be summoned, she practically sprinted across the polished floor, her white ceremonial gown trailing behind her like a bridal train. She threw herself at the feet of Jocks, the alpha of the Silver Moon Pack. Jocks leaned forward on his massive throne of carved bone and fur. His golden eyes flared with predatory amusement as he took in the stunning blonde groveling before him. In my past life, I had been the one kneeling there, blinded by his rugged charm and the false promise of a peaceful kingdom. Now, knowing the monstrous, blood-soaked reality of his bedroom during his rut, looking at his muscular frame only made my stomach churn with violent disgust. "I choose you, Alpha," Arabella declared loudly, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall to ensure every single person heard her. "I offer my blood, my body, and my loyalty to the Silver Moon Pack." Jox let out a low, vibrating growl of approval. He reached down, his massive, clawed hand gripping Arabella's delicate chin and forcing her to look up at him. "Bold little human," the Alpha rumbled, a wicked smirk playing on his lips. "I like them bold. You are mine." Arabella shot a triumphant, vicious glare over her shoulder, aiming it directly at me. Her eyes practically screamed her victory. She genuinely believed she had just secured the future of the world and condemned me to a life of misery. I held her gaze, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "Enjoy the crown, sister," I thought, a dark, icy amusement settling deep in my chest. "I hope it comforts you when he starts tearing your flesh from your bones." With Arabella claimed, the attention of the hall naturally shifted to me. As the sister of the newly claimed Alpha Bride, the political pressure was immense. The elegant, ethereal elf prince sat on his throne of woven silver branches to the left, adjusting his silk robes with an air of arrogant expectation. He offered me a charming, devastatingly beautiful smile, fully expecting me to fall into his lap just as my sister had fallen into the werewolf's. I didn't even break my stride as I walked right past him. The elf prince's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, aristocratic outrage. Whispers immediately erupted throughout the chamber. The human dignitaries and the supernatural delegates leaned forward in their seats, their eyes widening in absolute shock as my path became undeniably clear. I was walking toward the right side of the hall, toward the shadows. The Vampire King sat on a throne forged of jagged, unpolished obsidian. Unlike Jox, who radiated a suffocating, aggressive heat, or the Elf Prince, who practically glowed with magical light, the Vampire King absorbed the light around him. He was a black hole of terrifying, lethal power. His name was Valerius. In my previous life, Valerius was a phantom, a boogeyman used to frighten disobedient children. The vampires had only agreed to the peace treaty out of sheer boredom, and Valerius had never once taken a human bride in all the decades the choosing had been held. The rumors surrounding him were gruesome. It was said that any human who dared to approach his throne was drained completely dry on the spot, their lifeless husks tossed aside as a warning to the rest of the world. He didn't care about breeding a hybrid heir. He didn't care about ruling the world. He already considered himself a god walking among mortals. The temperature in the hall plummeted dramatically as I stopped at the base of the obsidian steps leading up to his throne. The air here was freezing, crisp, and smelled faintly of copper and winter frost. Valerius was draped in a sweeping coat of dark velvet, his posture relaxed but coiled with the lethal tension of a striking viper. His skin was the color of pristine marble, contrasting sharply with his raven black hair. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from my lungs. They were a brilliant, glowing crimson, endless pools of ancient, unapologetic violence. He looked down at me, clearly bored by the interruption. "Are you lost, little human?" Valerius spoke. His voice was a physical sensation, a smooth, freezing caress that slid down my spine like a blade of ice. It was quiet, yet it carried effortlessly over the frantic whispers of the crowd. "No, Your Majesty," I replied, my voice steady, completely refusing to bow my head. "I am exactly where I intend to be. I am offering myself to the Night Court." A profound, terrifying silence slammed down on the Alliance Hall. Even Jox paused his celebration, his golden eyes narrowing at the sheer audacity of my choice. Arabella looked confused, her triumphant sneer faltering as she tried to calculate why I would willingly choose a known death sentence over the safety of the elves. Valerius slowly leaned forward, resting his sharp chin on his pale hand. The boredom in his crimson eyes flickered, replaced by a microscopic spark of dark curiosity. "Offering yourself," the Vampire King mused, the words tasting like a foreign delicacy on his tongue. "Do you know what happens to fragile little things that offer themselves to monsters, girl?" "I know the rumors," I answered evenly, holding his terrifying gaze without flinching. "I know they say you drain brides for sport. I know they say you have no interest in the hybrid pact. I am not here for the pact." Valerius raised a dark, elegant eyebrow. "Then why stand before my throne and invite your own death?" I took a slow, deliberate breath. I couldn't tell him about my past life. I couldn't tell him about the roaring flames, the smell of my son's burning crib, or the burning desire for apocalyptic revenge that had driven me to his feet. I needed a truth that a creature of ancient darkness would respect. Because I would rather be devoured by a true king of the dark, I stated boldly, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, than be chained to a domesticated beast masquerading as a monarch. A collective gasp echoed behind me. I didn't need to look back to know I had just gravely insulted Jocks. A low, threatening snarl rumbled from the center throne, but I ignored the werewolf completely. My focus was entirely on the immortal predator in front of me. For a long, agonizing moment, Valerius simply stared at me. His crimson eyes pierced through my flesh, dissecting my soul, searching for any trace of deception or hidden fear. He found a woman whose fear had already burned to ash in a previous lifetime. Suddenly, a dark, breathtaking smile curved the Vampire King's pale lips. Fascinating, Valerius murmured. He stood up. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his physical presence was intoxicating. He was well over 6 feet tall, moving down the obsidian steps with a terrifying, fluid grace that made no sound. He stopped directly in front of me, entirely invading my personal space. The freezing cold radiating from his body was intense, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. He reached out, his long, cold fingers gently grasping my chin. The contrast of his freezing skin against my warm flesh was electrifying. He tilted my head to the side, completely exposing the vulnerable curve of my neck. To seal an alliance with the Night Court, blood must be drawn, Valerius whispered, his lips hovering mere inches from my pulse point. I do not know how to be gentle, human. My claim might stop your fragile little heart, then let it stop. I whispered back, closing my eyes and exposing my throat further to him. Valerius didn't hesitate. I felt the sharp, agonizing pierce of his fangs breaking my skin, sliding deeply into my flesh. I gasped, my hands instinctively flying up to grip the heavy velvet of his coat. But it wasn't just pain. The moment his venom hit my bloodstream, an explosive, overwhelming rush of pure, unadulterated power surged through my veins. It was a cold fire, blinding and euphoric, sweeping away the last lingering phantoms of the nursery flames. He drank deeply, holding me firmly against his chest as the entire Alliance Hall watched in horrified fascination. He didn't drain me dry. He took exactly what he needed to bind us, his claim establishing an unbreakable, ancient magical tether between my soul and his. When Valerius finally pulled back, a single drop of my blood stained his pale, perfect bottom lip. He licked it away slowly, his crimson eyes blazing with a newfound, terrifying possessiveness. He looked down at me, seeing the dark, vengeful fire swirling in my own eyes. You are not a sheep waiting to be slaughtered, the Vampire King observed quietly, a dark thrill coloring his freezing voice. You are a weapon waiting to be aimed. He offered me his arm, his expression hardening back into an impenetrable mask of aristocratic cruelty. Come, my queen, Valerius commanded, turning to face the shocked assembly. We have a world to conquer. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Alliance Hall was instantly shattered by a deafening, furious roar. Jocks surged to his feet, his massive, heavily muscled frame vibrating with primal, uncontrollable outrage. The sheer force of his sudden anger caused the carved bone armrest of his majestic throne to violently splinter into a dozen jagged pieces. His golden eyes, previously filled with arrogant, predatory amusement, were now locked onto me with absolute, murderous intent. You dare insult the silver... Jock snarled, his voice dropping into a terrifying, guttural register that made the human delegates cower in absolute fear. He took a heavy, threatening step down from his elevated dais, his claws instinctively extending from his fingertips. You think you can just walk away from the choosing, spit on my name in front of the entire continent, and live, you pathetic little human? I didn't flinch. I didn't even take a step back. I felt the freezing, impenetrable aura of the Vampire King standing right beside me, acting as a living, breathing shield of ancient darkness. Valerius didn't turn his head fully to address the enraged werewolf. He simply cast a slow, agonizingly bored glance over his velvet-clad shoulder. Control your temper, Valerius warned smoothly. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the chaotic, echoing hall like a perfectly sharpened guillotine. Or I will have you put down and skinned before the moon rises. Jocks bared his fangs, his chest heaving as his inner wolf fought violently to break the surface, but he stopped dead in his tracks. Even the arrogant, bloodthirsty alpha of the Silver Moon Pack knew better than to provoke a physical altercation with the ancient, undisputed monarch of the Night Court in an enclosed diplomatic space. Beside him, Arabella desperately clung to Jox's massive bicep. Her beautiful, perfectly painted face was a convoluted mask of absolute confusion, lingering fear, and sick, twisted relief. She had won the alpha. She had secured the path to the throne she so desperately craved. But my blatant, shocking rejection of the established hierarchy had completely stolen her moment of triumph. She stared at the bleeding bite mark on my neck, entirely unable to comprehend why her sister would willingly invite a monster's lethal venom into her veins. You will understand soon enough, Arabella, I thought, offering her one final, completely chilling smile from across the room. When the monster you chose locks the bedroom door during his rut, and you realize you are trapped in a slaughterhouse. Let us leave this pathetic circus, Valerius murmured, dismissing the enraged werewolf as if he were nothing more than a minor buzzing insect. He guided me out of the Grand Alliance Hall, his grip on my waist firm, possessive, and terrifyingly cold. The massive oak doors slammed shut heavily behind us, completely severing my ties to the fragile human world and my tragic past life. Waiting in the shadowy, fog-drenched courtyard was a magnificent, heavily armored carriage forged from dark, polished steel. It was pulled by 4 massive, coal-black steeds with eyes that burned like dying, violent embers. A pair of elite vampire guards, their faces obscured by intricate silver masks, bowed in absolute, silent reverence as Valerius approached. He seamlessly assisted me into the carriage. The interior was a cavernous, luxurious space of plush, dark crimson velvet and polished mahogany. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving the safety of the diplomatic sanctuary behind, the reality of my impulsive, revenge-driven choice finally began to settle heavily onto my shoulders. I was entirely alone in a moving fortress with the most feared, ruthless predator on the continent. Valerius sat opposite me, his incredibly long legs crossed casually. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy coat and produced a pristine, monogrammed silk handkerchief, tossing it lightly onto my lap. "You are bleeding on my velvet," he noted dryly, his glowing crimson eyes tracking the single, dark drop of blood trailing down my collarbone from the puncture wounds he had left. I picked up the cold silk and pressed it firmly against my neck, wincing slightly as the lingering, euphoric sting of his venom flared hotly in my bloodstream. "My apologies, Your Majesty." "Why did you do it?" Valerius asked, entirely abandoning the aristocratic boredom he had displayed in the hall. The predatory, fiercely calculating monarch was now fully engaged, dissecting my every breath and micro-expression. "I felt your racing pulse when I bit you. There was fear, yes. But beneath that fear, there was a hatred so profound, so incredibly violent, it practically tasted like ash on my tongue. You did not just reject the werewolf. You utterly despise him. Why?" I looked out the heavily tinted window at the passing dark, ancient forest, my mind briefly flashing back to the roaring, crimson flames and the agonizing, heartbreaking cries of my infant son. I swallowed the heavy, suffocating lump of grief lodged deep in my throat. I couldn't afford to be weak. Not here. Not with him. "Because Jox is a rabid beast masquerading as a king," I answered slowly, turning my gaze back to the terrifying vampire. "He believes fear and brute, mindless force are the only currencies that matter in this world. He will eventually tear his own kingdom apart from the inside out, and you wish to watch him fall from the safety of my shadows?" Valerius mused, a dark, fascinating smirk playing on his pale lips. "No," I corrected, leaning forward slightly, the dark, vengeful fire returning to my eyes with a vengeance. "I do not want to just sit back and watch him fall. I want to be the one holding the leash when he hangs." Valerius stared at me, the silence in the moving carriage stretching into a heavy, electrifying tension. For the first time in centuries, the ancient vampire king was genuinely, profoundly surprised. He had expected a terrified, desperate human fleeing a bad political match. Instead, he had just brought a ruthless, calculating conspirator directly into his court. Suddenly, a deep, vibrating chuckle resonated from his broad chest. It was a terrifying, beautiful sound that made my heart skip a frantic beat. "You are either a brilliant strategist, my little human, or completely, unapologetically insane," Valerius murmured, his crimson eyes flashing with a dangerous, intoxicating approval. "We shall see which it is." The carriage traveled for hours, plunging deeper into the treacherous, sunless territories of the far north. The temperature dropped drastically, intricate patterns of frost blooming across the carriage windows. Finally, the massive, imposing silhouette of the obsidian keep emerged from the freezing, dense fog. It wasn't a standard royal palace. It was a sprawling Gothic nightmare of towering black spires, jagged stone battlements, and heavy iron gates that looked as though they had been designed to keep vengeful gods locked out. The castle was bathed in a perpetual, ethereal twilight, casting long, menacing shadows across the snow-covered courtyard. As the carriage came to a smooth halt, Valerius stepped out first, offering me his freezing, pale hand. The moment my boots touched the frozen cobblestones, I felt the overwhelming, suffocating weight of 100 immortal eyes locked onto me. The courtyard was lined with the vampire aristocracy, pale, devastatingly beautiful creatures draped in dark, expensive silks and heavy winter furs. Their gazes were a terrifying, volatile mixture of predatory hunger, aristocratic disdain, and absolute shock. Valerius had returned from the Sacred Peace Summit not with a signed treaty, but with a bleeding, breathing human bride. A stunningly beautiful female vampire with cascading raven hair and eyes like shattered emeralds stepped forward from the aristocratic ranks. She moved with a lethal, serpentine grace, her gaze entirely fixed on my pulsing, vulnerable throat. "Your Majesty," she purred, her voice dripping with venomous, unchecked jealousy. "You brought us a warm snack from the Alliance Hall? How incredibly thoughtful of you." Before she could take another aggressive step toward me, Valerius moved. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a hidden weapon. He simply released a fraction of his oppressive, apocalyptic aura. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his dark power violently slammed into the courtyard, forcing several lesser vampires straight to their knees. The beautiful female gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck by an invisible hammer, her emerald eyes widening in profound terror. "Look very closely, Celine," Valerius commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the frozen ground beneath our feet. He wrapped his strong arm securely around my waist, pulling me flush against his side. "This is not food. She bears my royal mark. She is the queen of the night court. If any of you so much as look at her with hunger, I will personally drag you by your hair into the sunlight and watch your flesh turn to ash." The absolute, unquestioning submission of the entire immortal court was instantaneous. Every single vampire in the courtyard immediately bowed their heads, entirely deferring to the terrifying, uncompromising will of their ruthless king. I stood perfectly still in the freezing air, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, but my spine remained straight as an arrow. I had survived the burning nursery. I would survive this Gothic nightmare. Valerius looked down at me, his crimson eyes burning brightly in the perpetual twilight. "Welcome home, my queen," he whispered.